Hey guys, tonight we're going back in time, way back to a place of dim torchlight, creaky wooden benches, and courtrooms that smell faintly of tallow and mildew. You're not the audience tonight. You're the judge, sort of, or at least, you've been summoned into a peculiar little piece of history that modern textbooks mostly skip. You arrive at court just before dawn. The sky outside is a dull ash gray. There's no gavel on your bench, no powdered wig on your head, and certainly no smart black robe like in today's dramas. Instead, your hands are gently clasping a small, spiral snail shell. Everyone else in the room seems to have one too tiny, pearlescent, and oddly reverent, like some sacred artifact. Is this a joke? Did you miss a meeting? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Midnight in Manchester, sunrise in Sydney. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The courtroom smells of beeswax candles, wet stone, and something else you can't quite place. Your breath fogs slightly in the early morning chill. Paperwork sits in tidy bundles, if you can call ragged parchment tied with fraying twine tidy. There's a hush in the room as the townsfolk take their seats. The accused fidgets under a cloak patched with matted fur. You're not quite sure what he's on trial for, something about 3 stolen hens, a broken fence, and a very insulted goose. And still, that snail shell. You look down at it resting in your palm. It's smooth, slightly warm from your skin, and light as a whisper. There's something oddly calming about it, something ancient. You spot the other judges doing the same, occasionally lifting it slightly when a testimony strikes them, almost like a gesture of consideration, or maybe caution. No one explains it. No one dares to laugh. Historians today still argue whether these shells were practical tools, symbolic tokens, or just the weirdest fashion trend ever to hit the legal system. But here in the courtroom, surrounded by solemn faces and clinking armor, they seem to carry weight. A gravity. You try not to drop it. The plaintiff begins to speak. His voice trembles, partly from nerves, partly from cold. He's older, missing a few teeth, and wears a cloak stitched together from what appears to be burlap and ambition. He claims the accused let his goat loose during the market and caused mayhem. The hens flew off. One hasn't come back. He cries, eyes gleaming with theatrical pain. He clutches a small cross to his chest like punctuation. The accused grumbles, denies everything, blames the weather, says the goat has free will. The bailiff nods, scribbles something into the margins of a curled-up document. You raise an eyebrow, and the courtroom goes quiet again. You lift the snail shell just slightly, not for judgment, but curiosity. This tiny thing, plucked from a field or a garden, has made it into the center of a human drama. A soft, slow creature now becomes the witness to tempers, property rights, and local gossip. You can't help but find it funny. Not loud funny, just that warm, sleepy sort of funny where things make sense in the moment, even if they really shouldn't. There's a superstition here, unspoken but present, that the shell keeps things measured, not rushed, that no matter how loud someone gets, how passionate the story, the judge's touch on the shell keeps the pace grounded. A reminder to think slow, to rule carefully. It's almost ironic. In modern times, we associate snails with laziness, slackers, but here, in this candlelit court, they symbolize control, dignity, wisdom even. You're pulled back from your thoughts when someone in the crowd sneezes. The spell breaks slightly, and a crier pounds the floor once with a staff carved from oak. Order, apparently, must be kept even if it was only disturbed by an unfortunate nose. You glance down again. The shell hasn't moved. As the testimonies swirl and the arguments meander, the case begins to shift. It turns out this may not be about chickens at all, but about land. A shared plot, a broken arrangement, and, of course, a goat with no respect for boundaries. The kind of dispute that's more personal than legal, but has now been dragged into the formality of court. You lean back on your hard wooden bench, shift slightly to relieve the pressure on your spine, and marvel at the complexity of it all. You half wonder if the snail ever had such conflict in its little world. Probably not. Just moss, a leaf, and quiet. It's almost restful. There's a lull. The crier has dozed off in the corner. You watch the defendant try to pretend he's not chewing on something. And you, the judge, cradle the shell and feel strangely present. Anchored, one fact you remember from somewhere floats into your mind that in certain parts of Europe, especially small village courts, judges weren't always trained professionals. Sometimes, they were just the most respected farmer, or the smith with the least enemies. You begin to suspect that might be the case here. Still, they carry themselves with purpose, and the snail shell adds to that weight. There's something endearing about a justice system that moves at a snail's pace. Literally, the testimony ends. A rooster crows somewhere outside, as if it, too, wants its version of events heard. The fire in the brazier pops softly, sending shadows twitching across the stone walls. It's nearly time to deliberate, but not too fast. You glance down at the snail shell again. Still there, still quiet, still waiting. You're still holding the shell. It fits in your palm like it was made to be there light. Cool at first, but now gently warmed by the cradle of your fingers. Outside the courtroom, the pale light of morning has begun to seep through the slits in the wooden shutters. You can hear a cart rolling over cobblestones and someone hawking bread that's almost certainly burnt on one side. But in here, it's quiet again. The accused shifts his weight, looking down at his boots. He knows the verdict is coming, and while the charge of goat negligence might not sound earth-shattering, you suspect there's more pride than livestock at stake here. And still, no one's told you why you're holding this snail shell. You glance round. Your fellow judges sit in stillness. Their hands also hover near identical shells. The motion is subtle, like someone contemplating a coin before a decision. You notice that some rotate the shell slowly between thumb and forefinger. Others keep theirs motionless, resting like a paperweight on ancient thoughts. It's all very serious, and also slightly ridiculous. But here's the thing about medieval judges: they didn't have robes, gavels, or gavels carved from centuries of precedent. In fact, for a long time, they didn't even have a single set of laws. The legal system was a patchwork of local customs, church edicts, and royal decrees scribbled hastily by clerks whose quills were usually soaked in more wine than ink. So in place of consistency, they had ritual, ceremony, repetition, and the snail shell. It became part of that slow, deliberate rhythm. It might surprise you, but medieval judges didn't always wear anything to mark their position. No powdered wigs, no flashy collars. Some were indistinguishable from the townsfolk they were judging. A judge in York might wear the same sheepskin jerkin as a miller in Kent. Instead of spectacle, they relied on subtle gestures, the way they sat, the way they handled parchment, the way they cupped a snail shell in their hand and didn't speak until the time was right. Some believe it started as a local tradition in certain parts of southern France, where snail shells readily found and symbolically loaded were used in folk rituals for patience and clarity. Others think it was the result of a traveling priest trying to instill humility in a rather arrogant circuit judge. Let the snail teach you, the story goes. It moves forward, but never in haste. Of course, historians still argue whether any of this was formalized or just one of those strange customs that spread like a song passed from town to town without ever being written down. One traveler notices a judge holding a shell, tries it himself, and suddenly it's a trend. Sort of like how everyone suddenly started wearing cloaks made from hedgehog wool one year, and then just stopped. You shift in your seat again. The courtroom is stiff and full of tension, but also laced with something gentler. You feel it in the way the clerks take care with their quills, the way the crier stifles a yawn, but bows his head respectfully, the way the townsfolk remain silent, even when they disagree, because even if the law is messy, the process is something close to sacred, or maybe just really traditional. You raise the shell again slowly. It's not dramatic. It doesn't clang like a gavel or shout like a verdict. But the room shifts. The accused stiffens. The plaintiff straightens his back. This is the unspoken signal. Deliberation is near. You close your eyes briefly and try to imagine being a real judge in this era. No books of case law, no precedent databases, no friendly reminders from a bailiff whispering case facts in your ear. Just your memory, your moral compass, and a spiraled shell that reminds you to go slow. It's funny how people used to associate speed with error. Today, we worship efficiency, instant verdicts, 30-second news summaries, apps that tell you the weather in 12 cities at once. But in this courtroom, being fast is considered suspicious, reckless, even dangerous. A hasty judge was often seen as a corrupt one, or at least a lazy one. That's where the shell comes in. Not as a tool, exactly, and not quite as jewelry, but as a message to yourself and to everyone watching. I will not rush this. I will not be swayed. Maybe it worked, maybe it didn't, but the snail shell came to mean something. There's a record from a 13th century Flemish court where the judge reportedly dismissed an entire case not because it was baseless, but because the plaintiff kept interrupting him while he was turning the snail shell over in his hand. The judgment: let he who cannot wait not beg for justice. A little petty, but poetic. And you wonder, did he make that up on the spot? Or was that a line all judges used when they were just plain tired? The deliberation begins. You lean forward. So do the others. The air feels different now, still heavy, still serious, but laced with something older, something ritualistic. You remember someone once wrote that medieval justice wasn't about facts. It was about feeling, the balance of truth, the weight of a tale. And so, the judges murmur among themselves, soft, low voices, like monks in morning prayer. No shouts, no slamming fists, just slow discussion. You can't hear every word, but you catch bits. The goose was agitated before, a goat. Yes, but under supervision. The fence wasn't marked. One judge taps the shell 3 times against the wood. Another turns his upside down. Apparently, that means something. And you remain still. You listen, you weigh, you breathe. The shell rests in your palm, its spiral catching a glint of candlelight. You feel something ancient hum beneath your fingertips. Justice, maybe, or maybe just the echo of a very slow snail, moving through time, unnoticed but deliberate. You're still in that courtroom, surrounded by flickering candlelight and a low murmur of cloaks shifting, wood creaking and fire snapping. The deliberation has moved into a kind of trance, nothing written down yet. No firm verdict spoken. Just murmurs, pauses, and the snail shells, still in every judge's hand, spinning occasionally like a nervous stick or a sacred gesture. One of the younger clerks, barely into his 20s by the look of his beard, patchy and brave, ambles over to a shelf at the back wall. There, beneath a sheaf of dusty flax scrolls and a curled-up, cut, a very sleepy participant in today's proceedings, lie the records. Or, more accurately, the papyrus purgatory. This is where medieval legal documentation goes to crumble, spines buckled, bindings warped by damp air, the ink faded into ambiguous grays and browns. You can smell them even from here. Mildew, garlic, tallow, a hint of something metallic, perhaps old blood, or more likely, oxidized ink and brass. You try not to sneeze. The clerk unrolls a scroll and squints at it like it owes him money. Then he brings it forward and lays it reverently on the center bench. One of the judges sighs and leans in. Another scratches at his scalp, probably wondering if this is the case from 3 years ago where someone stole a dozen leeks and tried to blame it on a traveling herbalist. The medieval record-keeping system wasn't exactly a beacon of order. In theory, there were categories: land disputes, livestock mischief, inheritance spats, the occasional exorcism request. In practice, you got what the ink allowed: a shaky hand, poor spelling, no punctuation, and the occasional doodle of a fish in the margins when a scribe got bored or tipsy. Historians have long debated whether medieval clerks were trained or just survived. There's a growing theory that many records were preserved not out of design, but because they were too confusing to throw away. We don't know what this says, but someone might, someday, became the unspoken motto of every parchment hoarder from Norwich to Naples. And so these documents lingered, crumpled, faded, sacred. They were rarely read, but never discarded. You glance at the snail shell in your hand and then at the screw on the bench. In a strange way, they feel like cousins, both symbols of slowness, permanence, and inscrutability. Both whispering, *, take your time, *, neither being particularly helpful. As you watch, the judges read from the scroll, or try to. One mutters a line, stops, frowns, reads it again upside down. There's a line in Latin that seems to suggest the goose from today's complaint may have a criminal record. You blink. You can't be sure, but there's a tiny drawing of a goose next to the margin, with what might be a sword. You choose to let that one slide. There's a reason courts didn't lean heavily on precedent back then. The records weren't standardized. Every case was its own little storm cloud, judged on vibes, fairness, and the whispers of the snail. And sometimes, the parchment was used twice, scraped clean and rewritten, like reusing your grocery list to write a poem. A palimpsest, they called it, from the Greek for scraped again. The ghosts of earlier cases hovered beneath newer ink like courtroom phantoms. You could read them if you tilted the parchment just so in the firelight. A theft trial beneath a land deed beneath a laundry bill, one beneath the other, layered like secrets. It's no wonder, then, that medieval judges had to rely on more than just text. They needed instinct, community memory, a good nose for half-truths, and a very firm grip on their snail shells. And here's the curious part. In some regions, particularly rural Brittany and parts of Lombardy, the snail shell became more than a personal item. It was passed between judges, like a token, a continuity of conscience. He who holds the shell, one document claims, remembers the weight of past words. You think that's poetic, possibly invented, but still poetic. There's a gentle knock at the wooden door. It opens slowly, revealing a messenger wrapped in a wool cloak damp from rain. He enters quietly and hands over a scrap of folded vellum. A new complaint, possibly urgent, possibly not. The court pauses. One judge places his shell gently atop the scroll, as if saying, *, this is enough for now. *. You mimic the gesture. The clerk sighs, mutters something about never-ending goats, and shuffles off to file the scroll. Or bury it, or feed it to the cat. There's a rhythm to it all, slow, strange, deliberate. The courtroom feels less like a hall of power and more like a theater troupe trying very hard to remember their lines in a play no one wrote down. And that's the charm, isn't it? In an age without standardization, without filing cabinets or court reporters, the process had to carry its own memory. Rituals became anchors. Props became signposts, and snail shells. Snail shells became reminders, not of speed, but of intention. A signal that you are not here to punish. You are here to understand. Your fingers tighten slightly round the spiral. It's smooth, light, and, somehow, it still feels heavier than parchment. Your fingers still cradle the shell, its smooth spiral now etched into your palm like a soft brand. The courtroom breathes slowly around you, people shifting in benches, a coal hissing in the brazier, equal scratching somewhere in the background. You feel suspended, as though time here spirals too round, not forward. Then a thought flickers. Why the snail? Why not a stone, or a coin, or a feather? Something easier to carry, less fragile, less, well, good isn't. Turns out, the snail has a long and winding history, one that loops far outside the courtroom and deep into medieval symbolism. While today we poke fun at their pace, back then, snails weren't mocked. They were admired in illuminated manuscripts across Europe. From the Book of Hours to obscure herbal texts, snails creep across margins like tiny allegories. Monks doodle them next to prayers. Scribes tuck them into margins beside psalms. And always the snail was climbing. It became a symbol of perseverance, of humility, and sometimes, in the strangest of turns, of nobility. One popular theory among scholars is that snails represented the slow and steady path of faith, the humble man's journey towards salvation, each enchurned with effort. Others argue it was more about comic relief, a way to lighten dense pages with whimsy. But that doesn't explain why they show up in legal manuscripts too. Yes, really. Historians have found court records where the snail appears next to the judge's name, often delicately inked, almost reverent. It wasn't just cute. It meant something. In one 14th century Italian codex, a marginal note reads, Asterisk, the snail reminds the wise to move without haste and without pride. Asterisk, another shows a drawing of a knight mid-duel with a monstrous snail. It seems ridiculous what man would raise a sword against escargot. But this image became oddly common. A knight battling a snail. Sometimes serious, sometimes absurd. Some say it symbolized the futility of aggression. Others believe it mocked the arrogance of knights, showing even the slowest creature could challenge a man clad in steel. But many think it was a whisper about justice. That power unchecked must face even the meekest resistance. The snail wasn't the joke, it was the reminder. And so, in a courtroom, it makes perfect sense. A judge in a snail shell quiet chamber, faced with bribes, lies, power plays, and local politics, might need something gentle to keep him grounded. Something humble, something that whispers, be patient, be small, and still press forward. Of course, not everyone agreed. There's a spirited debate among modern historians about whether this symbolism was official or just a happy accident of overlapping metaphors. Was the shell carried with meaning? Or was it just a convenient object from someone's lunch one day that caught on? One camp says the practice started in monastic courts, where Benedictine values of patience and humility were woven into every gesture. Another argues it rose from peasant courts, where snails common in fields, easy to find, were chosen as a cheap alternative to costly court seals or tokens. A third theory, satire, that it all began as a prank or parodian. Like many good jokes, was taken too seriously by the next generation. Historians still argue whether the earliest snail shell record in Dijon was a serious reference or just an annotation from a board clerk. You lean back in your stiff wooden seat, feeling the shell shift slightly in your hand. It doesn't answer the question, of course not. It's just there, quiet, ancient, spiraling inwards. The plaintiff, who's been quietly sulking since deliberation began, leans forward. Justice, he mutters, is slow. Someone chuckles. You think it's the bailiff. Another judge nods solemnly, as though he's heard the phrase before and always found it meaningful. Maybe he has. Maybe it was written on a scroll once, or whispered during a particularly messy sheep theft trial. The crier stirs, scratching at his ankle. You're suddenly aware of how quiet the courtroom is again. The snail shell feels heavier now. You remember a tale perhaps apocryphal of a judge in Bruges who refused to rule until a snail crossed the entire courtroom floor. "Let nature set the pace," he said. "We rush only when we are afraid." The trial, by the way, took 2 days. The snail, unmothered, and while the story sounds like something made up to make school children groan, it was recorded in a 16th century diary. That's enough to keep it alive. Sometimes stories outlast facts, especially when they're slow. You look round at the others. Not a soul is impatient, not a brow furrowed in frustration. They know that waiting is part of the judgment, that speaking too soon can undo a delicate balance, that the snail's wisdom is in silence, not speed. And maybe that's the point. In a world where kings made impulsive decrees and landlords wielded power like a bludgeon, the courtroom needed a counterweight. A symbol that said, "Here, we move differently." A shell, spiral and small, saying, "Asterisk, breathe. Think, pause, asterisk." You tighten your grip just slightly. The verdict hasn't come yet, but it will. Slowly, the candle near your elbow gutters, sending a lazy twist of smoke into the stale courtroom air. You blink once, slowly, and realize the deliberation has stalled not in a chaotic way, but in the way an old millstone slows when the wind is calm. Nobody minds, nobody stirs. This is part of it, the lull, and during this lull, something unusual happens. A side door creaks open, not dramatically, just a soft, groaning sound like an old man stretching. Everyone turns, slowly. You're not sure if it's protocol or just curiosity. In walks the pig. Yes, a pig, not just any pig, this one's been scrubbed. You can tell because most pigs don't have that kind of shine unless someone's very serious about the outcome of a trial. It's wearing a blue ribbon behind its ear and appears, if such a thing can be said of pigs, deeply unimpressed. The bailiff bows, the crier clears his throat, and the court hears the next case. The pig is charged with manslaughter. You would laugh except no one else does. See, animal trials were very real in parts of medieval Europe. Pigs, goats, cows, even insects found themselves dragged before magistrates to answer for their crimes. It sounds absurd to modern ears, but to the people of the time, it made perfect spiritual and social sense. Animals were seen not just as property, but as moral beings, creatures of God's order who could, under certain circumstances, commit sin. If a pig trampled a child, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was a breach of divine justice. And justice, even then, had to be visible, formal, symbolic. The pig stands in the defendant's spot, or perhaps wobbles slightly. A monk nearby is reading from a short scroll detailing the incident. You don't catch every word, but the tone is deadly serious. Apparently, this pig wandered into a field where children were playing, knocked over a bucket, and chaos ensued. One child fell, struck his head, and was lost. The villagers demanded retribution, and so here you are. You glance down. One of the judges taps their shell rhythmically on the bench. Another strokes it as if drawing wisdom from its spiral. It's strange, this tiny object, meant to symbolize patience and reflection, is now part of a ritual that includes livestock litigation. You try not to think too hard about that. There's a brief discussion on whether the pig showed remorse. The monk shrugs. The bailiff glances at the pig, who chooses that moment to yawn. That doesn't help its case. Historians still debate whether these trials were sincere or merely theatrical, a kind of public reassurance that justice existed for all creatures, great and small. Some say they were a legal necessity, a way to assign responsibility and compensation in a world without insurance. Others think it was symbolic penance, a way to balance divine order. But then, there's the snail shell again. You realize now that in cases involving animals, especially ones where human life was lost, judges often touched their shells more frequently. Some even placed them beside the accused, as if asking the creature to acknowledge its own place in the spiral of justice. And the symbolism deepens. the spiral becomes more than patience. It becomes process, an admission that justice is not a straight line from guilt to punishment, but a winding path with many pauses, turns, and considerations. Even if the defendant happens to have 4 legs and a snout. The pig snorts. One of the clerks flinches, dropping the scroll. It lands with a papery thump and unrolls halfway across the floor. No one moves to pick it up. Not yet. The moment must pass. Eventually, the judges confer. You hear one say, "It was not malice, only misfortune." Another responds, "But still it must not go unmarked." The verdict is announced. The pig will not be executed. Instead, it is banished from the village, never to return. Its owner, a weaver with tear-stained sleeves, must take it to the next town over and sell it at market profits to go toward the child's memorial cross. Justice, medieval style. And no one questions it. You wonder if the snail shell influenced the decision, if its presence kept things from tipping too far in either direction. No bloodlust, no blind mercy. Just slow, weird, measured consequence. As the pig is let out, tail twitching, the judges place their shells back on the table. One lingers, holding his aloft for a moment longer, then sets it down as if sealing the moment. Outside, you can hear the sound of bells, distant and irregular. Probably a shepherd guiding his flock. The day has grown brighter, and somewhere nearby, bread is being baked. The next case won't be as dramatic. Probably someone arguing over a boundary stone or a duck that's been crossing into the wrong pond. But the snail shell will still be here. And so will you. The courtroom shifts again. A few villagers rise and leave, satisfied that justice strange, sticky, and slightly muddy has been served. The pig, for all its angst and indifference, has exited with more ceremony than most nobles would expect. You can still hear it protesting faintly outside, as if demanding a second opinion. Inside, things grow quieter once more. A new case begins. Something about a disputed line of inheritance, no animals involved this time. Just cousins who both insist they were promised a barrel of apples and the same patch of soggy turnip flour. And as one cousin begins his complaint with arms flailing and voice climbing like a rooster on caffeine, you notice the judge beside you gently presses his snail shell against his temple. It looks absurd, but you understand. Because here's where the church begins to ooze into the scene, sometimes literally. The ecclesiastical courts, those sacred halls of clerical judgment, had a tendency to adopt the habits of their secular cousins. And vice versa. Law and religion, never quite separate, began to imitate each other in the most fascinating and sometimes utterly confusing ways. In theory, the two systems were distinct. Secular courts handled land disputes, theft, contracts, and your more typical peasant quarrels. Church courts, on the other hand, tackled the messy business of marriage, morality, excommunication, and occasionally, whether someone was sleeping with their neighbor's goose. Yes, that was a thing, and no, we won't. But in practice, the line blurred, and as clerics began to preside over more public matters, or as lay judges borrowed the solemnity of monks to lend legitimacy to their rulings, or traditions began to cross-pollinate, including, apparently, the snail shell. You see, patience is a Christian virtue. The Benedictine rule, for example, emphasizes humility, obedience, and restraint. And if ever a creature embodied restraint, it was the snail. Small, defenseless, home-carrying, and slow. Clerical writings began referencing the snail as a metaphor for the soul's journey, measured, deliberate, and constantly retreating into itself for reflection. Some even likened the spiral of its shell to the path of contemplative prayer. Naturally, then, symbols made their way into the courtroom. You glance again at your shell, feeling it less like an object now, and more like a message passed down from judge to judge, perhaps even from abbot to abbot, with silent approval. In some remote abbeys, church officials were known to carry small totems during trials, crosses, stones, feathers. But there are scattered notes, tucked in between psalters and sermons, of the spiral emblem held at judgment. Could it be? It could. Historians still argue whether this means a snail shell or some other spiral object, perhaps a twist of ivory or a curl of vine. But the term appears again in a dusty 12th century French codex, asterisk to judge as the snail walks, slowly, always forward, and never with pride. Asterisk sounds familiar, doesn't it? And there's more. Some courts began to formalize the shell's presence. In parts of Lombardy and central Germany, clerical judges kept baskets of them behind the pulpit, cleaned, polished, even perfumed. Before trial, each judge would choose one, a symbolic act, and during the trial, they would hold it to their ear, not for some magical whisper, but as a quiet prompt to listen, because judgment, they believed, began with silence. You try it. You raise the shell slowly, carefully, and press it near your ear. There's no sound, really, just the hum of the room, your own heartbeat, maybe the gentle fizz of a log collapsing in the brazier. But it feels right. It feels ceremonial. One of the judges catches your eye. He nods, barely perceptible, like a bishop acknowledging a monk during Vespers. You wonder if this is part of a larger ritual no one ever wrote down, a tradition carried only in gestures and glances. The plaintiff drones on about apple trees now. He claims the orchard boundary was marked by that big stone shaped like a duck's backside. His cousin objects, the stone, he insists, is clearly shaped like a loaf of bread. Important distinctions, clearly. The room breathes with restrained laughter. Even the bailiff smiles, but no one interrupts. The process matters. Even absurdity deserves a fair hearing. You notice the cleric seated near the window, muttering prayers beneath his breath. He's not part of this trial, but he watches closely, perhaps learning, perhaps judging silently. In his lap, a small velvet pouch, and from its mouth pokes, yes, a snail shell. You almost chuckle. You shouldn't be surprised anymore. The blend of the sacred and the secular was never clean in medieval Europe. If anything, the church was always ready to appropriate local customs, especially ones that emphasized restraint, humility, and calm. The shell, in this context, was ideal. It required no Latin, no gilding, just presence, and so courtrooms both religious and civil began to mirror each other, not in law, but in rhythm. Slow, deliberate, looping like the spiral of a shell. A judgment is finally reached in the apple orchard case. The land will be split not equally, but fairly. One cousin gets the trees, the other gets the dark loaf-shaped stone and rights to collect windfall apples after dusk. Both nod, both sigh, a compromise older than contracts. The judges, in unison, lay their shells gently down. A thumb outside, rain, heavy now, cold and clean. You feel a draft brush across the back of your neck and shiver slightly. The fire crackles louder in response. The courtroom smells of damp wool, ash, and old paper. And still, that little shell glows faintly in the flickering light, quiet, watching, wise. The afternoon drags its fingers through the courtroom, stretching time like old leather. You've settled into your seat in that uniquely medieval way, one buttock numbing, the other arguing with your spine. But your hand still rests gently on the snail shell. Its coolness is oddly constant, as though untouched by the heat of breath or body. The next case is slow to begin, but no one minds. This is expected. Deliberation is not a disruption of justice, it is justice. As you wait, you begin to notice how many decisions, movements, even glances in this room are slow, almost ceremonially so. The man stacking the parchments does so one at a time, aligning each edge. The clerk who dips his quill does so in careful rhythm. The judge across from you twirls his shell not nervously, but deliberately, once clockwise, once counterclockwise, like a ritual dance that no longer needs explaining. It all points to a deeper belief: slow is wise. That's not just a medieval quirk. Across many parts of Europe during this period, patience was seen not as a luxury, but as a virtue, especially in the legal system. Swift judgment was associated with emotion, corruption, or pride. Slowness, that meant you were resisting influence, resisting temptation. Enter the snail. It's no longer surprising to learn that the little gastropod came to represent more than just calm. In many legal contexts, it stood for measured wisdom, the kind that didn't bend under pressure. Some 14th century court manuals in Flanders mention tokens of balance, which might refer to small items judges carried as private reminders. Some carried beads, some feathers, and in certain towns, especially near Bordeaux and Carcassonne, judges began using the snail shell as a kind of ward against bribery. You pause here, because this part is genuinely fascinating. You'd think the shell was just symbolic patience, humility, etc. But in some records, judges actually wrote that they used the shell as a reminder to keep the hand closed. In other words, when holding the shell, they couldn't accept a coin. Historians have found side notes in personal ledgers that say things like, carried shell today, turned away silver from wheat merchant. It wasn't just poetry, it was practice. This makes sense in a culture where bribes were an ever-present temptation. Justice was local, often personal, and rarely well-paid. If someone offered you a pouch of salt or a smoked goose in exchange for a favorable ruling, well, that was just Tuesday. But holding the shell, that was something else, a signal, both public and private. That said, not today. You glance around the room and realize you've seen it happen. Subtly, a merchant approached a judge earlier, whispering something with a hand on his belt pouch. The judge, without saying a word, raised his snail shell ever so slightly and then turned it upside down in his palm. Message received, nothing exchanged. You didn't think much of it at the time, but now it rings clearer. The shell wasn't just a token of thought, it was a barrier, a silent refusal. There's even a surviving story, possibly exaggerated, but delightful, about a judge in Burgundy who, when offered a basket of smoked trout under the bench, simply placed his snail shell inside the basket and handed it back. The case was dropped. The briber, shamed, never returned. Slow justice, symbolic justice, moral justice. Sometimes a little shell was all it took. And then there's the spiral. That shape wasn't lost on medieval minds. The spiral appeared in religious iconography, in architecture, in art. It symbolized the journey inward, the self-examination needed to find truth. Monks meditated on spirals. Builders carved them into columns. Judges held them. You begin to suspect that the spiral itself was part of the ritual. Turn the shell in your fingers, and the spiral unwinds or tightens, depending on your mood. Some judges reportedly meditated by simply watching it. Others whispered their verdict into it like a confession before speaking aloud. It might sound odd, but when your world is full of omens, saints, and unseen forces, the spiral becomes a guide, a path. One of the other judges speaks softly now. A verdict is being prepared, but no rush, not yet. The plaintiff, an aging miller with a voice like gravel, has finished his appeal. The defendant, his cousin of course, stares straight ahead like a man regretting a lifetime of flower thefts. And in that pause, you feel the weight of the shell again. Not heavy, exactly, just firm, steady, and changing, like a promise to think before speaking. The judges confer. Words are few, glances more plentiful. One of them sets his shell down momentarily to rub his eyes. Another reaches over and gently nudges it back toward him, as if to say, don't forget who you are while we decide this, And finally, the decision is rendered. The mill will be shared. Alternating weeks, the water rights remain with the town, not either man. The feud, centuries old by the sound of it, is now declared cool as Riverstone, a phrase you don't entirely understand, but it sounds final. The cousins nod. There is no cheering, no handshakes, just a mutual grunt of agreement and the soft swish of cloaks as they leave. A judge exhales, places his snail shell back into a small wooden box beside him. The box is carved with a spiral. Of course it is. You stretch your fingers slightly, the snail shell now resting loosely in your palm like a thought halfway formed. The courtroom's air has thickened again, less from tension, more from time itself folding into this small space of quiet ceremony and long-winded disputes. No one's in a hurry. You certainly aren't. And the next case doesn't seem to mind waiting its turn. While the clerk shuffles some parchments and the bailiff briefly leaves to untangle a mule tethered too close to the window, you let your eyes wander to the objects. They're everywhere. Little personal items tucked beside each judge. Carved walking sticks, a sliver of obsidian, a ribbon of blue cloth, a string of acorns. They look like tokens from a scavenger hunt or mementos from a very peculiar picnic. But no, these are part of the performance. No, more than performance, choreography, because medieval justice wasn't just about laws. It was about ritual. And with that came objects, symbols, props. The snail shell was one of many. Every action in the courtroom had its visual counterpoint. A turn of the shell, a finger to the lips, a parchment unrolled only halfway to signify provisional acceptance. Even the way a judge folded his arms could signal we're listening, but not believing. And here's where it gets interesting. Some judges choreographed their every gesture in advance, like dancers performing justice rather than simply dispensing it. In southern German courts, according to fragmented records, there existed an actual guide called the silent script of virtue. It was less of a manual and more of a gesture glossary. Raise your left hand with the shell. That meant case accepted but unproven. Tap the shell on the bench twice. Claim dubious. Witnesses required. Of course, not every court followed this, but many did. And over time, this system became second nature. You start watching for it now. And sure enough, it's everywhere. One judge closes his eyes and touches the tip of the spiral with his thumb while listening to a weaver describe a dispute involving 20 spindles and an unruly hen. That gesture, according to a surviving marginal note from a court in Avignon, it means listening, but skeptical. The shell became a kind of judicial semaphore, and what's more, it worked both ways. Litigants, those brave enough to notice, began tailoring their arguments based on these subtle gestures. If a judge spun the shell rapidly, it was a sign of growing irritation. If they set it down, that meant you were either winning or boring them. It was hard to say which. The courtroom, then, wasn't just a space for argument. It was theater, quiet theater, and the shell, that was the prop held center stage. You wonder if the judges themselves even realized how coded their actions had become, or whether this was the medieval version of an unconscious tick, the way someone today might click a pen or tilt their head when thinking. Only here, it carried meaning. Wait, there's even a legend, her footnote. Half folklore of a blind judge in Aragon who carried a particularly large snail shell into every hearing. He claimed he could hear lies through it. The spiral hums, he told onlookers, when men distort the truth. No one could prove he was right. No one could prove he wasn't. You shift in your seat, and your own shell slips, rolling to your fingertips. You catch it gently, the movement natural now, like scratching your chin or folding your hands in prayer. It grounds you, slows you. That's the power of ritual. The church knew it, the court knew it, and the people, those who came to watch justice play out like an incense-scented opera, knew it too. There's something comforting in knowing what gesture comes next, what motion signals the end, what posture means. We've heard you. Now hush, And when the bailiff returns, slightly damp and smelling faintly of hay, the next case begins. A border dispute this time. Two farmers, one old, one older. They both insist the same mossy rock has been on their side for 27 years. Neither has moved it. Both have built fences round it. One claims the rock hums when touched at dawn. Yes, hums, you sigh internally. And so does the judge beside you audibly. But he does something else too. He lifts his snail shell and rotates it slowly in his palm, holding it out just enough for both farmers to see. They pause. This, apparently, is the universal medieval signal for asterisk enough theatrix let's proceed. Asterisk. The older of the two bows slightly. The younger, who is still at least 65, crosses his arms but stops talking. You begin to appreciate how the shell is more than symbol or superstition. It's part of the very language of the court. And like all language, it can be learned, interpreted, even misused. There's a tale from Lombardy of a judge who used his shell like a puppet, exaggerating its movement to intimidate plaintiffs, waggling it when unimpressed, spinning it when bored. Eventually, a higher court banned him from using it at all asterisk, bringing disrepute upon the humble spiral. Asterisk, the ruling read. Still, others revered the ritual. In Florence, judges were buried with their shells, nestled in their palms or placed upon their chests. One grave inscription reads, asterisk, he moved slowly, and so moved rightly. Asterisk, the case concludes. The rock, it turns out, doesn't hum, but it does mark a natural spring, now considered shared property. The judges declare the moss sacred. Fences must be redrawn. No one cheers, but one farmer nods so slowly it might count as applause. You return your attention to your shell. It hasn't changed, but you have, because now you see every motion as part of something bigger. A dance, a language, a ceremony spiraled round fairness, deliberation, and the quiet weight of choosing wisely. The courtroom is quiet again, and by now, you've learned to treasure the quiet not as emptiness, but as texture, like the slow breath between notes in an old song. The judges sit straighter, their cloaks softening into shadows. Your shell feels warm now, familiar. You shift it in your fingers almost unconsciously, as though it were part of your body, like a knuckle or a joint that remembers its own movement. Then someone sneezes, loudly, heads turn, not in judgment, just recognition. It's a young clerk, red-nosed and mortified, who immediately bows and mutters apologies in Latin that may or may not be real Latin. The crier taps the floor once with his staff. Just once, it's enough. Order restored. The next case is announced. Herman the soap boiler versus the brothers Calabrino. Whatever this is about, it promises drama. But you're already watching the judges, how they move their hands, how they reach together into a small oak chest behind the bench. They're retrieving objects, not scrolls, not coins, props. One pulls out a short length of woven cord, another a split twig, and the third another snail shell, this one larger, pale cream, with a darker spiral. You blink. Apparently, this is a asterisk ceremonial asterisk shell. It's passed round only during disputes that involve tradesmen's codes, a set of unwritten laws that govern professions like soap making, coopering, weaving, and the like. Each guild had customs, signals, expectations. And sometimes, when those customs clashed, the court stepped in. But it didn't do so empty-handed. There's a belief, especially in central and southern France, that certain courtroom objects carried not just symbolic power, but professional memory. The snail shell, for example, wasn't just slow, it was steady, reliable, and so boilers. Their work was all about process, timing, precision, not rushing. So when a soap boiler stood trial, out came the ceremonial shell, not to mock but to honor. The brothers Calabrino, three stout men who smell faintly of goat fat and rose oil, present the complaint with a flourish. Their claim: Herman promised exclusive use of lavender essence, and then sold the same batch to a rival apothecary. Gasps are optional, but you provide one mentally anyway. Herman, for his part, looks exhausted. He gestures with stained fingers purple at the tips from Violet Ash and insists that the deal was never formal. A handshake in a rainstorm is not a contract, he says, which may well become your new favorite legal argument. And now the shell is passed. Each judge turns it once in his hand. Once for Herman, once for the brothers, once for the law. It's theater. Yes, but meaningful theater. In guild-based disputes, objects like the snail shell carried the weight of centuries of handshake deals, communal memory, and what we might call today honor codes. The slow spiral of the shell, passed silently, reminded all parties resolution must follow rhythm, not force. Historians still debate whether these prop rituals were scripted or spontaneous. Some call them symbolic scaffolding, tools to hold up an otherwise rickety system of oral custom and half-legible parchment. Others argue they were little more than pageantry, comforting illusions of order in a chaotic world. But when you watch Herman's shoulders ease just slightly as the ceremonial shell returns to the bench, you suspect it's more than illusion. You lean back slightly. The bench groans. Your shell, the ordinary one, remains in your palm. Not every judge had a ceremonial piece. Most used whatever was available. A shell from the garden, a token inherited from a predecessor. Even carved wooden spirals in colder regions where snails weren't common. One court record from Saxony details a spiral of pine, passed from judge to judge for 7 winters. Another from Navarre mentions a snail shell sealed with wax and buried with the final ruling of a controversial land feud. Rituals may begin in logic, but they survive in memory. And so it is with these shells. Back in the room, the decision is forming. The judges speak softly, nodding in turn. One draws a tiny spiral on a sheet of parchment, not official, just a thought mugger. The gesture alone feels meaningful, as though drawing the shape brings clarity. Then the judgment. Herman must refund half the fee. The essence batch will be split between the 2 buyers. And from now on, all deals involving fragrances must be witnessed by a third party. Everyone nods. Herman bows. The brothers Calabrino cross their arms in what appears to be satisfaction, though one of them mutters, "Still smells like sage." The ceremonial shell is gently returned to its box. Lid closed. Ritual complete. There's something beautiful about this slowness. This insistence on objects, on symbols. It transforms disputes over soup and herbs into something communal, sacred even. Not just decisions, but shared decisions, And you, still holding your own little shell, feel connected to it all. Not as an outsider looking in, but as a participant in something very old. Something very slow, and maybe that's the whole point. The light through the courtroom shutters has changed again. It's softer now, angled low, brushing golden lines across the floorboards and highlighting the texture of the parchment bundles stacked like old loaves of bread. Outside, somewhere, a bell rings, not the sharp clang of urgency, but the rounded, lazy toll of late afternoon. You've lost count of the number of shells in this place. There are the ones held by judges, the ceremonial shell used during trade disputes, the carved wooden imitation tucked into the sleeve of a particularly fidgety bailiff. Even the clerk, yes, that sleepy one hunched over a stack of rulings, keeps a smaller shell next to his inkwell. Maybe for luck, maybe for listening. And now you learn something stranger still. The next judge speaks softly, with the tone of someone about to share something everyone else has heard a dozen times but still enjoys. We move slow, he says, because the snails taught us. If you in the room nod, you blink. Not quite a proverb, not quite a joke. And here begins a curious tale, one told in whispers, footnotes, and folk memory. It's the story of the asterisk Moorish snails. Asterisk, you sit up slightly straighter. The crier clears his throat with ceremonial drama, as if he, too, knows this one deserves respect. The tale begins in the Iberian Peninsula, during the tangled centuries of the Reconquista, a time of shifting borders, cultural exchange, conflict, and an easy coexistence. Christian and Muslim kingdoms traded, married, and, yes, shared courtroom rituals. In one town now lost or renamed, a judge from a Christian court reportedly visited a Moorish sultan's chamber to observe how justice was rendered. And they saw it. A row of small snails, live ones, kept in a glazed bowl on a bench beside the sultan's seat. Not for eating, for watching. Whenever the sultan was faced with a complex case, he would glance at the snails. If they crawled quickly, he postponed the ruling. If they remained still, he interpreted it as a sign that his thoughts were also still ready. Clear? Now, did this actually happen? Historians still argue whether this bowl of prophetic snails ever existed or was simply a medieval legal fairy tale. Some say it was a misinterpretation of a Moorish calendar ritual. Others suspect it was metaphor stretched into memory. Someone observed the sultan being asterisk patient, asterisk, and the snails were added later, like spices to stew. But something about the story stuck. After that, snail shells began appearing more regularly in courts across Aragon, Castile, and eventually into Provence and Burgundy. Not just found, but asterisk imported asterisk. Decorative shells, glazed, pitted, some were carved with verses, others sealed with wax. It became fashionable, even respectable, for a judge to claim he held a Moorish shell, as if this imbued his rulings with extra weight, cultural depth, maybe even a little magic. You recall now an earlier moment, a judge whose shell had strange etchings, curved lines, dots. You thought it decorative. Maybe it was one of these. The influence was subtle but real. Some legal customs began to change. Where once a judge might deliver a ruling immediately after testimony, now they waited a day, sometimes two, called it letting the shell rest. This didn't happen everywhere, but in enough courts that people began to expect the delay, and began to see slowness not as weakness, but as authority. The shell transformed from mere symbol to asterisk method, asterisk, and that blending of cultures, Christian and Muslim. Moor and Frank wasn't limited to architecture or cuisine. It crept into the legal world, quietly, like snails on stone, shaping process by example rather than decree. Even today, a few dusty law books from 15th century Toledo bear small spirals stamped into the margins beside especially considered decisions. Some suggest this was the scribe's way of noting rulings that had followed the patient rhythm inspired by Moorish customs. You shift your own snail shell once more, not because you're copying anyone, but because it feels right. There's something oddly global about this tiny spiral, found in gardens and courtyards, in ink margins and court chests, shared between cultures that, in other places, were at war. A symbol that slowness, at least here, belonged to no single people. A quiet reminder that good ideas like justice, like snails, don't need borders. They just need time. A new plaintiff enters the room. A woman this time, wrapped in dyed wool, face withered and purposeful. She holds no papers, just a woven pouch. She walks with the confidence of someone who's been here before, and who knows the weight of the silence. She places the pouch on the table, gently opens it. Inside, a snail shell, smaller than yours, pale brown, slightly chipped. She sets it before the judges, saying only, "This came from my grandmother. She said to bring it when truth needs patience." The room falls still. No one laughs. The judges nod. You've seen enough now to understand. This isn't an artifact. It's a language. And this woman, she's fluent. The woman stands there, quiet, hands folded in front of her like she's holding back a flood of words. Her snail shell sits patiently on the table, its chipped edge turned slightly toward the judges, as though it's listening. 2. The judges examine it. Not in a scientific way, no one's measuring ridges or peering inside. They look at it with something closer to reverence, or maybe recognition. This shell, they understand, is more than a prop. It's an offering, a signal, a promise that what follows is meant to be heard slowly. She begins. Her voice is steady, if a little hoarse from age or weather or both. She speaks of a boundary, one marked not by fence or stone, but by memory. Her family has grazed goats along a stream bank for generations. Now, a wealthy miller is claiming that patch of grass, claims he owns the stream itself, has deeds, maps, a man with ink and money. But her family, just the shell, a slow inheritance. There's a ripple through the room, not loud, just a subtle shift in posture, the kind that happens when people recognize something ancient in a new story. The clerk jots notes on curled parchment. The crier shifts his weight and closes one eye, listening like a man trying to place a half-forgotten melody. You can smell rain on his cloak. It's started again outside. Faint pattering on the roof. The woman places both hands on the table and continues. No theatrics, no trembling, just careful words shaped by memory. The miller, when he enters, has the unmistakable look of a man used to winning. His boots shine, his tunic is embroidered, and he holds his snail shell differently between thumb and forefinger, like a coin about to be spent. Interesting. Historians write about this posture. The merchant hold. It meant decisiveness, assertion, a readiness to cut to the conclusion. In some regions, it was considered rude. In others, just expected. The judges watch silently. Then one of them, an older man with a face like carved oak, raises his shell slowly and lays it flat on the table. The others follow. It's a signal, a ritual pause. The plaintiff must step back. The defendant may speak, but slowly, the miller obliges. He lays out his documents, vellum and ink, crisp and confident. He points to marks, measurements, official seals. Everything looks right, but something about it feels rushed. Too sharp, like an arrow in a place made for stones. The shell on the table does not move. You begin to realize this entire trial will pivot not on what is written, but on what is felt. That was the thing about medieval, just as paper mattered. Yes, but so did testimony, gesture, tone, and memory. Especially in rural courts, and especially when both parties claimed truth from different directions. That's where the snail shell came in. Not to prove anything, but to slow the decision until it could sit beside conscience. Judges would sometimes sleep on the spiral, as one proverb went. Lay their shell beneath their pillow the night before a verdict. Absurd, perhaps, but in a world where signs and symbols carried moral weight, this wasn't superstition. It was practice. You look again at the woman's shell. It's imperfect, but it's hers, a living link to the past, a memory spiral, and memory, in this court, matters. One judge turns his own shell 3 times, then speaks softly. Have the goats always crossed the same tree? The woman nods. They know the bend before the bark does. It's a phrase of the land, rooted, and it carries more gravity than any deed. Historians still puzzle over how decisions like this were made. With so little documentation, so many rituals, so many nonverbal cues, it seems chaotic to modern minds. But there was order, just not the kind that fits neatly into spreadsheets. You begin to notice more now. The judges lean in slightly when the woman speaks. They glance at the shell when the miller does, not because they distrust him, but because the speed of his speech presses against the room's rhythm. Too quick, too clean, and the shell resists. One scholar wrote that the snail shell served as a conscience conductor, a tool that filtered urgency from importance. That might sound poetic, but watching this case unfold, You see what he meant. The woman speaks of springs, of grazing lines drawn by hoofprints rather than rulers, of her father's father, who said rushing goats is like rushing snow, it doesn't stay. The judges nod, not at her words, but at her pace. And so, when the ruling is made, it's no surprise. The land stays hers. The deed is valid, yes, but too recent, too sudden, and the shell, well, it didn't turn for him. The miller accepts the decision with tight lips. He tucks his shell back into a pocket, already looking toward his next argument, his next scroll. But the woman, she lifts her shell, bows, and walks slowly out, like someone leaving church after lighting a candle. The judges sit back. One of them breathes deep, almost sighs, then rolls his shoulders with a crack. The shell stays on the table, for now, and you, watching all this unfold, realize how much has been said with nothing more than spirals and silence. The courtroom exhaled again. It's not a loud release, just a shift, like fabric settling or old wood remembering its shape. The woman is gone. The miller's boots have faded down the hallway, and all that remains now is the soft rustle of parchment and the rhythmic drip of water from a ceiling beam no one's quite gotten round to fixing. A judge taps his snail shell once. Then again. It's not a signal for the next case. Not exactly. It's a signal to reflect. Sometimes the court doesn't proceed immediately. Sometimes it pauses, not because it's unsure, but because the moment needs to settle. Like flour after kneading, like tea before pouring. And as the judges shift and whisper and tap, you start to understand. Not all uses of the snail shell are about law. Some are about conscience, in so medieval texts, tucked between law codes and sermons, you'll find references to clean judgment. A term that doesn't mean correct in the legal sense but clean in the moral sense. Untouched by pride, bias, greed, and the snail shell, odd as it sounds, came to symbolize that idea. There's an anecdote from a 15th century court in Ghent where a judge was caught accepting bribes. Not coins or favors, but subtle things. Extra firewood, better bread. A wink from a merchant when barley prices dropped. Nothing official, just little things. When discovered, he wasn't exiled or jailed. He was given a punishment that sounds absurd to modern ears. He was forbidden from using a snail shell ever again. The punishment struck deeper than a fine, because without the shell, he had no anchor, no symbol of stillness, no reminder. The story ends with him retiring, voluntarily, and spending his last years carving spirals into wooden bowls over and over, until his hands couldn't hold the knife anymore. You might laugh, or feel something tug behind your ribs. In this courtroom, where time has its own rhythm, those spirals matter. Another judge, this one younger, maybe 35, with the beginnings of crow's feet and the kind of hair that never quite combs flat, leans forward. He's holding a shell, yes, but not deadly. He's whispering to it. You almost smile. It's not a joke, not here. Some judges, especially in the Rhineland, were known to speak their doubts into the shell before issuing a verdict. A kind of moral murmuring, a way of checking their ego, their certainty. The idea was, if it feels wrong when said to something so old and so quiet, maybe it is wrong. Of course, not everyone believed this. Some historians dismiss it entirely, calling it shell mysticism and blaming it on a century too obsessed with omens and folk logic. But the records are there, in trial logs, in letters, in wills. One judge in Bohemia reportedly wrote, "I fear no man, but I fear what I feel when I rush. That is when I turn the spiral." You understand him now, because here, in this slow-moving room full of wool and wax and old air, the act of not rushing is a kind of courage, of faith, and that's why the snail shell remains. Even when courts modernized, Even when laws were codified and wigs became standard, some judges still kept a shell on their desk. Hidden, maybe, but there. As a reminder, one of the judges now opens a small box behind the bench. Inside are several shells, not ceremonial ones, not decorative, just plain, worn shells. Some cracked, some yellowed. He holds the box up and addresses the others. There's no speech, no bump, just a pause, and each judge takes one. This, you learn, is a practice known in certain northern courts as the shared spiral, used in rare moments when consensus is difficult. Each judge takes a fresh shell, holds it for a full minute in silence, then places it on the table. The judge whose shell is warmest, held longest, most deliberately is asked to speak first. Not because he's the loudest or highest in rank, but because he took the most time. This is how tiebreaks begin. It's absurdly analog, impossibly human, and weirdly beautiful. You feel your own shell grow warmer again as the moment unfolds. They are not just voting. They are weighing dash with their hands, their hearts, their hesitations. Eventually, one judge speaks, the others listen, and like that, the impasse pauses. No gavel, no raised voice, just spirals and time. Later, a clerk will document the ruling in tight Latin, rolled and sealed and filed. But the real decision happened here, in breath and silence and heat, one shell at a time. By now, you've stopped checking the hour. The sun could be halfway to setting or halfway to rising again. Time bends inside this courtroom, softened by firelight and the slow turns of spiral shells. You've grown used to it. The rhythm, the hush, the strange serenity of judgment at a snail's pace. The next case begins without announcement. A young man steps forward barefoot, eyes low. He holds nothing, no scroll, no evidence, just calloused hands and a leather cord round his neck. At its end dangles, and surprisingly, a shell. A small one, faded, worn to near translucence at the tip. The judges straighten in subtle, synchronized fashion. This is not a common sight. A snail shell worn as a necklace wasn't a fashion statement. It meant something different. It meant legacy. In some parts of medieval Europe, especially rural Wales and the Pyrenean foothills, families passed down certain shells through generations not just as mementos, but as judicial relics, each one tied to a past ruling, a decision that had shaped the fate of land, name, or bloodline. This shell, then, carries a verdict. And the man, he's not here to plead a case. He's here to challenge one. It's rare, but it happens when a ruling from years past surfaces, not through written appeal but through memory, custom, and object. He speaks softly, in the old dialect, rhythm unhurried. His great-grandmother, he says, once stood here. Her goats had wandered into a nobleman's vineyard. She was fined beyond reason. The vineyard owner, it turned out, had been the brother-in-law of the presiding judge. A whisper of corruption, and she, unwilling to accuse, simply pressed a shell into the judge's hand. According to family law, he ruled against her anyway, and then left town. But the shell remained, and now, 2 generations later, her great-grandson stands here not to reverse the past, but to record it properly. There is no compensation to seek, no land to reclaim, just a request to have the original ruling marked with a sign of doubt, a public note of reconsideration. You blink. You hadn't known this was even possible. But one of the judges nods, as if this is known, if rare. There exists, apparently, a tradition in certain courts to annotate past decisions, not erase them, not override them, but spiral them anew. A coiled mark is added to the margin of the original scroll, not a cross-out, not a correction, just a sign that time and conscience have looped back around. The process is called returning the spiral, It's one of the most solemn acts a medieval court can perform, because it admits that justice is not fixed, that fairness can fade, be missed, be remembered later. And so the judges rise, one by one. Each touches their snail shell to the man's, gently, not ceremonially, but personally. Then the youngest judge leaves the room, returns minutes later with a rolled parchment, dusty, delicate. It is, somehow, the very scroll from that original case. You wonder how that's possible, but you've stopped questioning miracles here. It is unrolled carefully. There, at the bottom, is the old verdict, in tight script, and next to it, space. One judge dips a stylus in dark ink and draws a tiny spiral. One full loop, no flourish. Then a second judge, with a steadier hand, adds a small line beside it, asterisk doubt, raised with reverence, asterisk no blame, just acknowledgement. The young man watches without moving. When they are done, he nods, reclaims his shell, and bows low enough that his necklace clinks gently against the floor. He leaves with no money, no title, but he leaves with something heavier, recognition. The courtroom is still. You realize that this, too, is part of the shell's purpose. Not just to slow down asterisk now asterisk, but to asterisk reach back asterisk, to spiral inward to memory, to allow time to loop, correct, heal. Historians struggle to categorize this process. There are no laws that mandate it, no official term for this ritual, but in the records, in the footnotes, in the folk songs passed between villages, you find echoes, asterisk the shell never forgets, asterisk asterisk the spiral keeps turning, asterisk asterisk even old stones remember when touched, asterisk you glance at your own shell, and for the first time, it feels like it's holding asterisk you, asterisk not the other way round. The courtroom is nearly quiet enough to hear the wax melt. One of the candles has begun to lean slightly, its base pooling into a soft golden lake on the edge of the bench. No one moves to fix it. It leans and leans and leans until finally, with the gentlest puff, the flame surrenders to its own weight. Still, the light remains. There are other candles, other moments. You feel that now. That nothing in this place has not even endings. You roll the snail shell between your fingers again. The spiral is beginning to wear smooth in your touch. Or perhaps your touch is beginning to wear smooth in the spiral. Hard to say. Either way, it feels right. Then the clerk clears his throat, not loudly, but enough. He steps forward with a final document. The scroll is thicker than the others, tied with a ribbon the color of storm clouds. It's not about land, or goats, or spilled dye. It's about something rarer. Asterisk. A judge's retirement. Asterisk. The room stills. The oldest magistrate with the oak-creased face, and a voice like worn parchment rises slowly. He doesn't speak at first. Instead, he reaches into the folds of his robe and pulls out his shell. It is not small nor plain. It is thick, yellowed, and slightly chipped on one edge. The kind of chip that comes not from carelessness, but from having lived a long, attentive life. He holds it in both hands, not as a prop now, but as a relic, a friend. And then, in the hush that follows, he speaks, not of cases one always interpreted, but of asterisk moments, asterisk, of a child brought into court by her parents who fought over who would get her blanket, of a man who swore his sheep could count to 4 and demanded witness status, of a widow who spoke so softly the bailiff had to repeat every sentence twice. And in all of these cases, he says, it was the shell that kept him still. Kept him from rushing, from reacting, from ruling before listening. He places the shell on the bench. That alone would be enough. But it's not the end. One of the younger judges reaches into his sleeve and produces a cloth, embroidered with a simple spiral. He wraps the shell in it, then seals it with a cord. The other judges stand, one by one, They place their own shells beside his, creating a spiral of symbols across the bench, each a memory, a weight, a vow. It's not rehearsed. It's just how it's always been. This, you realize, is the asterisk retiring of the shell. Asterisk. An act performed when a judge ends his service not because of disgrace or illness, but because he has judged long enough, thought slowly enough, stepped back by choice. The wrapped shell will be placed in the court's archives, not with the legal scrolls, but in the box of judicial objects. This is a real term, found in inventories, church records, wills, a section separate from ink and seals. The judicial objects box holds the tools of temperament, shells, tokens, fragments of twine, sometimes even smooth stones or feathers. Items that reminded judges to be human. Somewhere in northern Italy, a monastery still keeps a small cabinet labeled asterisk objects del tribuno, asterisk. Inside are 12 snail shells, each tied with a ribbon. Beneath each, a name, a date, and a line from the final case the judge presided over. No laws, just memories. Historians don't always know what to do with these objects. They can't be filed under statute or ordinance, but they persist. They survive, not because they're useful, but because they're meaningful. And sometimes, meaning is the more durable of the two. Back in the courtroom, the scroll is read aloud. The judge accepts the retirement terms, offers no speech, just a bow. He walks slowly toward the exit, pausing only to touch the youngest judge's shoulder. A spiral past, not in words, but in gesture. He leaves. You watch the doorway long after he's gone, then glance at your shell again. You wonder how many have held it before you, how many stories it carries, how many silences it has measured. And in that thought, you feel something ancient, older than courts, older than ink. The need to move slowly, even when the world is rushing. To weigh, to listen, to spiral toward understanding, not away from it. The room breathes in his absence, not loudly, not all at once, just a soft, collective settling, like a field of grass resuming its stillness after the wind has passed. The benches creak gently as people lean back. The clerk's pen pauses. Even the crier, who rarely relaxes, lets his posture soften by a fraction. The retired judge is gone, but his shell remains, wrapped, archived, tucked away with the others, those quiet tools that never made law, but made law bearable. You sit with your own shell in your palm and let the hush linger. There's no next case. Not today. The docket has emptied itself out like a pond, gradually draining, leaving ripples, not noise. One of the junior judges closes a logbook with a quiet asterisk, thump asterisk. Its spine weary but faithful. A few townsfolk trickle out, shawls over shoulders, whispering goodbyes, stepping carefully as though trying not to disturb the history left behind on the floor. You remain seated, because there's something the others don't know. You're still holding your shell for a reason. It's not just a symbol now, it's an invitation to spiral inward, to feel the echo of 1,000 small decisions made slowly, kindly, and often imperfectly. You remember now how many times in your own life someone rushed you, pushed for an answer, demanded certainty, and how many times you wished you'd held a snail shell. There's a comfort in knowing that long before smartphones, clocks, or court stenographers, there existed a tradition that trusted time, that made slowness sacred, that allowed space for a silence to do its best thinking. Historians still argue whether the shell was ever asterisk official asterisk, whether it had jurisdiction, whether it was just prop or prayer. But you know now that doesn't matter, because justice isn't always about rules. Sometimes it's about weight. The weight of waiting, the weight of listening, the weight of a single, cold shell resting in your hand like a compass with no needle but plenty of direction. You rise, slowly, not because the story is over, but because it has spiraled to a close. The courtroom round you seems to nod. The benches, the parchment stacks, the dying fire. Everything settles, and as you walk toward the door, The snail shell in your hand catches one last flicker of light. Not bright, just enough to show its path. Not fast, but forward. Asterisk, asterisk, wind down final 300 words, asterisk, asterisk. And now, as the courtroom fades and the candlelight dims behind your eyelids, let's slow things down even more. You're walking now not through cobbled halls or crowded chambers, but across soft moss. The kind of moss that muffles footsteps and remembers how to cradle you. The courtroom's behind you, far behind. What remains is only the spiral. Quiet, slow, steady, in your palm. The shell cools, then warms again with your breath. You no longer think about goats or scrolls or angry merchants. Those voices are distant, like forgotten bells ringing in another village's evening. You're just you now, no judgment to give, no verdict to write. Only stillness, the kind that makes room for your thoughts to soften and coil, drift. The shell doesn't speak, but somehow it helps you listen. To the hush inside yourself, to the spaces between thoughts, to the long, slow spiral of breath that begins and ends with rest. You feel your shoulders loosen, your jaw unclench, even your heartbeat, always working, seems to ease into a gentler rhythm. There's nothing more to decide. No need to hold the shell anymore. Let it sit quietly on your chest, like a whisper or a lullaby. The story is done. The spiral continues, and you sleep.